My answer to that question, Sean, is no. You know, if you're going to have rules of the road of all the things that we've mentioned thus far, you don't want staff or volunteers or your board members enforcing those rules. You've got to think about that, and you've got to budget for that. I think one effective strategy is to consider having security folks professionally dressed, be able to approach someone in a respectful manner and remind them to pull up their mask or remind them to step back, to socially distant and the rest. And then if the reminders become multiple, then it's a discussion with the group. But you don't want to put your staff in that particular circumstance. So I would definitely think about, if you're going to have the code of conduct, again, rules of the road, make sure you know how you're going to enforce it, and make sure you take care of that cost. One comment and question that's come up a lot, I think, in the chat is, what about employees of the organizer? So, you know, the issue is, if an employee were to contract the virus, whether that be at their workplace or at a meeting off-site, that is a workers' comp issue between the employee and the employer. But you're going to have the same concerns of unwillingness potentially by employees to get the vaccine. And generally speaking, and my guidance has been all along, and those of our labor and employment folks, is, you know, don't force an employee to come into the office or to show up at the meeting if you don't need to. I think that's the respectful flexibility that we're going to need to have for a little while. So I think that point is clear, but really be careful, I think, on site. And, you know, the point has been made, manage it. You got to manage it on the ground. If you're going to have a rule, you've got to follow it. And folks are looking. Look, we all have a video camera and a photograph right in our hand. And maybe even more convenient than that. So, you know, folks are going to pay attention if we're not enforcing mask requirements. And not that that is the major issue. Of course, the major issue is you don't want to become a super spreader event. But it obviously also impacts. And I've had a number of nonprofits where their areas in the healthcare arena, certainly, or safety, that have raised issues. Like, we have to be the model, right? You know, we have to show how this is done. We don't want to have this headline use it against us. So Lisa, I know you and I have talked a lot about this issue as well, and enforcement. And I'm sure as well on the hotel side, it's frustrating if a group, you know, isn't enforcing rules, and maybe that's disrespectful or harmful potentially to a hotel staff.
And you're right. And we have seen, we've already seen things online where we've seen meetings where people are sitting there having a cocktail with their mask dangling, and, you know, people have been shamed for that kind of thing. I completely agree with Barbara. Whichever perspective it is, whether it's hotel or group side, it should be third parties that are enforcing these kinds of things, that are doing the temperature checks if you think that's appropriate, and enforcing the mask and distancing rules. You know, as you all know, it's sometimes easier to say, hey, it wasn't my decision. You know, the boss said I had to do it. Well, the same is true in this analysis. If you say, look, we have hired this third party company that their job is to enforce safety rules, and we have to defer to what they say. So if they tell you you have to put your mask on, or they tell you you have to step aside, that's a lot easier than having a volunteer or a colleague that your attendee may know say, hey, pull your mask up. And so I think that that's a good way to do it. I know that my hotel clients are very challenged in this arena, especially in the area of weddings, because weddings are some of the first things that are really coming back because people have been frustrated. And so they're having a wedding, and they have all these rules about social distancing and no dancing or wearing masks. And pretty soon everybody in the event has had a couple drinks and they're ignoring everything. And it's a really tough situation to be in for you as the hotel to have to try and enforce these rules. Or do you just put up signs saying, you know, dancing must be 6 feet apart, so that you can show that you tried to tell people and that you couldn't control them? And again, remember, underlying this whole thing is all the politics that people feel, and I'm using politics in a broad sense, the politics that people are feeling about this entire situation. And so you can get into arguments, problems, et cetera, that can be very difficult, which is why I think the third party approach is a very good way to handle it. So I agree with Barbara on that one.
Yeah, and Lisa, just to jump in on that, before I would be remiss in not mentioning this, you have to consider amending your crisis management plan to address a COVID outbreak, a potential COVID outbreak on site. How are you going to manage it? So if you haven't done that already, or if you don't have a crisis management plan, now is a great opportunity to do that. I know a lot of our industry folks and organizations have good resources out there, but run the drill. What would you do on site? That is really critically important, particularly if you're dealing in a circumstance like this where you have a highly contagious circumstance. Sean?
And you're never going to be able to prove where somebody got it. Yes, there are super spreader events, but when you have people coming from all over the country, you're never going to be able to prove for sure how it did or didn't happen. But if you can prove that you had a crisis management plan, that you had these steps in place, that you did everything that you possibly could that was reasonable, then you're going to be protecting yourself.